There's an episode of The Amazing World of Gumball that most people forget exists. It's called The Kids. It aired in 2014 as the very first episode of season 3, and on the surface, it's about Gumball and Darwin's voices cracking. Their voices start doing that thing voices do when you're 12 and your body's decided it's ready to embarrass you in public, going from something soft and familiar and recognizably yours into something deep and strange and completely out of your control. They go to the doctor. The doctor laughs, a little too cheerfully, and tells them that's normal. That's just what growing up feels like. And Gumball, being Gumball, takes this news approximately the same way someone might receive a terminal diagnosis. And the reason I want to start there in that doctor's office with that cracking voice and that quiet dread is because The Kids is the most honest 11 minutes that show ever produced. Not the funniest, not the darkest, the most honest. Because it looks directly at the thing that nobody really wants to talk about when they talk about childhood, which is the creeping, uncomfortable, slightly nauseating sensation that it's ending. That it was always ending, even from the very beginning. That there was always a clock ticking somewhere in the background, and you just couldn't hear it over the sound of everything being funny and strange and bright. That is what the amazing world of Gumball was about. The whole time. Not the void, not the philosophical framework of a simulated reality, not Rob's existential crisis, or the mechanics of cancellation as a metaphor for oblivion. Though all of those things are in there and they're brilliant, and they deserve every essay ever written about them. But underneath all of that, running quiet and steady like a river, you don't notice until you stop moving for a second. Gumball was about growing up, about what it costs, about who you are before the world decides who you should be, and whether those two things ever get to be the same person. About the specific, irreplaceable, slightly terrifying experience of being 12 years old and realizing for the first time that everything good is also temporary. So settle in. Get comfortable. If you've got a blanket, pull it up. If you're already in bed with the lights low and the phone tilted on the pillow, then this is exactly where you're supposed to be. Because tonight on Watterson Lore, we're going back to Elmore. Not to study the void, not to map the metafiction. We're going back to find what Gumball was whispering underneath all of that chaos, all of that color, all of those years. We're going to look at what the show is actually telling you about growing up. And my guess is that most of it, you heard. You just didn't know it yet. This is going to take a while. Let's begin. Part 1. The show nobody thinks about twice. The Amazing World of Gumball premiered on Cartoon Network on May 9, 2011. It was created by Ben Bocquelet, a French-born British animator who had spent years before that making commercial pitches for advertising clients and losing basically every single one of them. Years of creating characters that got rejected, shelved, forgotten. Cartoon characters who never got to be anything. Who just lived in sketch folders and pitch documents, and the kind of quiet professional grief that artists know very well when they have poured themselves into something and watched the door close on it anyway. And when Cartoon Network Development Studio Europe, which had just opened in London, asked its employees to pitch their own ideas for shows, Bocquelet did something that in retrospect feels almost poetic. He gathered up all those rejected characters, all those unnamed things that never made it to air, and he gave them a world, a home. His original concept was literally a remedial school for cartoon characters who had failed at being entertaining enough. A shelter for the ones that did not make the cut. A place where everything that had been left behind could still exist, could still matter, could still be somebody. Even if they were the kind of somebody nobody else wanted. The network liked it. But they told Bocquelet the original concept was too sad. The remedial school for rejects was too bleak a premise for a children's show, so he revised it into a family sitcom. He built a town called Elmore. He put the family at the center of it. He named the mother after his own mother. He named the father after his own father. He named the sister after his own sister. And he named the family, as a whole, the Wattersons, after Bill Watterson, the legendary, intensely private creator of Calvin and Hobbes, the man who walked away from one of the most successful and beloved comic strips in the history of the medium, rather than license it for merchandise or continue it past the point where he could still tell the truth with it. The man who chose to let his creation end rather than let it be diminished. That naming choice is a whole essay on its own. a show about characters desperately fighting not to be forgotten, named after the man who chose to be forgotten rather than compromise what he made. There is something profound in that tension, and we will return to it at the end of tonight's conversation. But for now, just hold it. Let it sit at the back of your mind. The show that resulted from all of that background was unlike anything that had aired on Cartoon Network before, and arguably unlike anything that has aired anywhere since. It mixed two-dimensional hand-drawn animation with three-dimensional computer-generated imagery, traditional stop-motion, puppetry, live-action photography, flash animation, and approaches that still resist easy categorization. As the backgrounds of Elmore were assembled largely from real photographs of locations, many of them from London and its surroundings, which gives the town this peculiar quality where everything feels simultaneously recognizable and slightly wrong. The ordinary convenience store has realistic wood grain behind the animated characters standing at the counter. The school hallways have real-world texture and light. The suburban streets look, at first glance, like actual suburban streets, until you notice the animated wolf walking past a very real parked car. This creates, intentionally, a world where nothing quite fits, where the mismatch is built into the visual grammar of every single scene. Every character is rendered in a different style. Gumball and his family are traditionally drawn two-dimensional characters, so Latina Rex is three-dimensional CGI. The Robinsons look like puppets, stiff and slightly uncanny. Idaho the potato moves with the subtle stop-motion quality of something with physical weight. Sussy is a live-action human chin filmed upside down with googly eyes. None of these characters belong in the same world. All of them are in it anyway, navigating the same hallways and cafeterias and streets, making the same kinds of messes and the same kinds of connections. That visual mismatch, which we will come back to in more detail, is not incidental to the show's themes. It is central to them. It's the show's way of saying, visually and before a single word is spoken, everyone here is a reject. Everyone here came from somewhere else, was designed for a different purpose, doesn't quite fit the space they're in, and somehow, out of all that not fitting, a world coheres. A family holds together. A story gets told. What it built across 6 seasons from 2011 to 2019, plus 2 miniseries in 2020 and 2021, plus a revival series called The Wonderfully Weird World of Gumball that arrived on Hulu in July 2025, was one of the most sustained, emotionally honest, formally inventive bodies of work in the history of animated television. It won International Emmy Kids Awards. It won British Academy Children's Awards multiple times. It earned the kind of devoted following that persists and grows rather than fading as the years accumulate. The kind where adults who watched it as children return to it in their 20s and discover entire new layers that weren't accessible to them the first time through. And yet when you ask most people what Gumball was about, they'll tell you it was the show with the blue cat and the talking goldfish. They'll mention the void if they've been paying close attention. They might reference a joke or a visual moment that stuck with them. But very few people, even devoted fans, will tell you that it was a comprehensive, careful, emotionally precise account of what it actually feels like to be young and scared and slowly, inexorably becoming something different from what you were before. That's the thread we're following tonight. Because if you watch Gumball as a child, you receive one show. If you come back to it later, especially in the quieter hours when you're old enough for the themes to have personal weight, you discover that Bockley and his team had been building something else the whole time. Something that was always there, patient and quiet, was waiting for you to have the context to understand it. They built a love letter to the experience of growing up. Not the idealized version, not the bittersweet Hallmark version, where everything resolves neatly and everyone arrives in the right place by the time the credits roll. The actual version, the one where you don't know what's happening to you while it's happening, where the people around you are too busy figuring out their own versions of the same thing to give you a reliable map. Where the world keeps moving and changing and revealing new information about itself at a pace that consistently outstrips your ability to integrate it. That's the show. That's what was underneath all of it. Let's look at what it actually said, and before we go any further, a quick request from me. If you're watching tonight, wherever you are and whatever time it is, drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and what hour it is. whether this is midnight in the Midwest or 4 in the afternoon on the other side of the world. We genuinely love knowing who's here with us. And if you're not subscribed yet, right now is a very good time. Hit that button. It keeps Watterson lore going, and it helps more than you know. Part 2. The Fear of Growing Up. What the kids was really saying. Let's go back to that episode. Let's actually sit inside it for a while. The Kids opens in the Watterson bathroom on an ordinary morning. Richard is washing his face, preparing himself with his usual mix of sincerity and complete absence of practical self-awareness for a day that is probably going to require approximately none of this preparation from him. And he asks Gumball and Darwin to guess his age. They respond with the Ice Age, then 1592 minus 100, which they work out on the spot to be 1492. Columbus discovering America? Then they ask whether he means BC or AD. Richard storms out. The joke moves fast and moves on. But there is something happening in that bathroom before the joke finishes. Richard is looking at himself in the mirror, asking his children to confirm something about how he appears to them, and the answer he gets is, "You look ancient. You look like you predate the concept of history." The distance between where they are and where he is feels so enormous to them that it's essentially a category difference, not a spectrum. And then Gumball and Darwin's voices start cracking. Not once. Repeatedly, at inconvenient moments, mid-sentence, mid-activity, mid-confidence. Something deep and unfamiliar erupting through the familiar register of their voices. They go to the doctor, and the doctor's answer is cheerful and complete and completely insufficient as comfort. That's just growing up. Your voices are changing. This is what transition looks like. This is the body announcing that the next thing is beginning. Darwin asks, with the particular quiet directness he has in his best moments, what's the best thing to do when you know your childhood days are numbered? And then they answer it themselves. They sing, "Make the most of it," a song about enjoying what you have while you still have it, running through every kid thing they can think of, loitering at the mall and eating candy and imagining themselves into other lives, other stories, other kinds of freedom. The animation in the song is gorgeous, yet partially handed off to the French animation collective CRCR, which gives portions of it a looser, more dreamlike quality. This is what the imagination looks like when it's fully fueled and not yet tired. The song is funny. It's a genuinely good song, but if you listen to it from inside a little more age, if you bring it even a few years of accumulated experience, what you hear underneath the jokes is something more specifically sad. The song is about the grief of a good thing that's running out. About the difference between time you're having and time you know you're running out of. About how the awareness of an ending changes the experience of everything that precedes it, makes it sharper and more specific, and somehow both more precious and more painful at once. This is the specific emotional register of late childhood and early adolescence. The moment when you become aware enough of time to know that you're in it, moving through it, that the version of yourself you're currently inhabiting is not permanent, that there will be a next version and it will be different, and you're not quite sure whether different means better. The twist when it comes is one of the most precise pieces of storytelling in the entire show. The doctor calls back. Gumball and Darwin are in the statistical minority, roughly 1% of the population, who simply do not age. Their voices cracked because voices crack, but they will not grow up. They will remain exactly as they are. And their response is not relief. That's the whole thing. That's what earns the episode its place in this conversation tonight. Because they should feel relief. That was the outcome they initially wanted. Gumball, in the first half of the episode, was resisting the idea of change, clinging to the familiar, dreading what was coming. And now what's coming is gone. He gets to stay. The deal is made. The clock stops. But the color goes out of the scene. Their expressions shift into something more complicated and less comfortable than the relief that should be there. Because in the process of learning to accept the change, of learning to sing about it rather than dread it, of making peace with the loss in the way that make the most of it required them to make peace with it, they had done something that they hadn't planned on. They had become willing to grow. They had reached toward the next thing, tentatively and bravely. And now that next thing is not available. Permanently. There is only this forever, and the forever part is its own specific kind of suffocation. The ending is described by TV tropes as a cruel twist ending, but I'd argue it's actually the most compassionate thing the show could have done, because it reveals the lesson not through a speech but through lived experience. You don't know you wanted the next thing until the next thing gets taken away. The fear of change and the desire for it are not opposites in adolescence. They're the same experience in two different costumes, and the show understood that and built an entire episode around the narrow, uncomfortable, deeply true space between them. This episode was also, on a very specific and literal level, a document of real children growing up. The original voice actors for Gumball and Darwin, Logan Grove and Kwesi Boki, I had been with the show since its first day of production. By season 3, their voices had changed in the way that voices do when you're a young person, and your body has its own timeline that doesn't consult with your professional obligations. Bakale talked about this in interviews, saying they had to say goodbye to Logan and Kwesi, had to make an episode that acknowledged the transition because pretending it wasn't happening would have been dishonest, and the show had never really learned how to be dishonest about the things that mattered. So, The Kids is simultaneously a piece of storytelling about fictional children, navigating a universal experience, and a document of real children living through it. The voices you hear changing in that episode are, in the most literal possible sense, the last recordings of those particular childhoods. And the episode knows it and honors it without ever being maudlin about it. With humor and honesty and a song that lets you feel the goodbye without forcing you to think of it in those terms. The show was 3 seasons old and it already understood, with a precision that most adult storytelling never reaches, how to acknowledge impermanence without making it into tragedy. How to say, something is changing, and that's real, and it's worth acknowledging, and then you go forward. The Kids was the opening argument. Everything else we're talking about tonight is an elaboration of what it started. Part 3, The Identity Problem. Gumball, Zach, and the Masks We Wear. In Season 3, there's an episode called The Name. It begins at an arcade. Gumball has just beaten a game and wants to enter his name on the high score screen. But the screen only allows 3 characters. Darwin suggests using his real name. And Gumball, standing in the fluorescent light of that arcade, realizes with a jolt that he doesn't know what his real name actually is. He knows he's called Gumball. He's always been called Gumball. But Gumball is a nickname that stuck. And the actual legal name, the one on the paperwork, the one his parents used before the nickname arrived, that he doesn't know. He asks Nicole. She tells him. His real name is Zach. Something shifts, not immediately and not all at once, but with the slow, creeping quality of something taking hold. Gumball starts leaning into the name. He introduces himself as Zach at school. He adjusts the way he carries himself, the way he talks, the way he moves through social situations. He pops his collar. He gets sunglasses. Yet he begins to develop the bearing of someone who has decided, quite suddenly, that they have been playing the wrong character for their entire life. And the correct character is much cooler than this. And Zach is different from Gumball. Notably, specifically different. Zach is confident in ways Gumball isn't, at least not consistently. Zach doesn't stumble or apologize or make the kind of ongoing, spectacular series of well-intentioned failures that has defined Gumball's arc since the first episode. Zach remembers the victories. More than that, he rewrites the defeats into victories. The time Gumball tried to jump across a gap and missed it and fell into whatever was below the gap, in Zach's memory, he made it. He cleared it. He was cool, and the moment was clean, and the embarrassment never happened. Every stumble, every failure, at every moment where Gumball was just himself at his most flailingly, genuinely, lovably imperfect gets progressively overwritten with a more flattering version. Darwin is the one who notices first. Darwin always notices first. And what Darwin sees as the Zach persona expands and takes up more space is the disappearance of something he can't immediately name. It's not Gumball's confidence, which Darwin has seen before in a less performed version. It's not his energy, it's something more specific. It's the honesty. The particular kind of honesty that comes from knowing your own failures and living with them without revising them. The ability to be the guy who tries things and crashes and shows up the next day anyway, because what else are you going to do? Gumball's failures are where his warmth lives. They're where his relationship with Darwin lives. In all the moments where Gumball needed someone to bail him out of a situation his optimism had created. Zack doesn't have those moments. Zack doesn't need bailouts. Zack only has wins. And a person made entirely of wins, the show is very precise about this, is not a fuller version of the self. It's a lesser one. It's a person with the texture sanded away, and the texture was where everything real was happening. The family eventually has to race to town hall to legally change the name back to Gumball before Zack finishes erasing Gumball from his own memories. The climax takes place inside Gumball's own mind, in a literal battle for his own history. And the anchor he finds is not a grand, heroic memory. It's a small, ordinary one, a real win at an arcade game. Something humble and unambiguous and completely his own. Something Zack hasn't been able to rewrite because it's too ordinary to glamorize. The small, real thing defeats the large, false thing. And that's the episode's clearest statement. Ben Bacalé named Zack after Zach Morris from Saved by the Bell, an explicit choice of the archetypal cool TV character as the template for the false self. The episode is funny. The comedy lands. But the thing it's actually about is one of the most important and least discussed experiences of adolescence, which is the specific pressure to be a different version of yourself. Not a better version exactly. Not a version that has worked harder or become kinder or developed real skills. A different one. The version that would get the high-score screen slot without the 3-character limitation. Not the version that people respect on sight, without requiring the long and embarrassing and stumbling process of being known. The version that looks the way you imagine maturity and coolness and having it together look from the outside. This pressure is everywhere in adolescence. It comes from the culture, from the media, from the particular social dynamics of middle school and high school, where the performance of confidence is simultaneously necessary for survival and impossible to sustain without cost. It comes from the discovery that you have some ability to curate how other people see you, which is both empowering and terrifying, because curating means choosing, and choosing means leaving something out. And what gets left out tends to be the most honest parts. The name is about what happens when you take that curation too far, when the performed version starts to overwrite the real one. When the edited self becomes the only self, and the unedited memories get revised into something less embarrassing, and therefore less true. It's about the death of the false self and the survival of the real one. And it frames the real self not as the grand, heroic version, but as the one that wins a small, ordinary game and doesn't need to make it bigger than it was. That's a quietly radical thing to tell someone who's 12. It's the kind of truth that takes most people much longer than they expect to fully believe. The version of you that shows its failures, that carries the evidence of its stumbles rather than editing them out, that arrives in the world as exactly as large as it actually is and no larger, that version is worth more than any polished alternative. Now, not because failure is good, because the willingness to know your failures is what makes honesty possible. And honesty, in the end, is the only way anyone ever genuinely connects. The show spent 6 seasons building Gumball as a protagonist who fails spectacularly and regularly and continues showing up. Who does things wrong and fixes them imperfectly and then makes them wrong again and fixes them again imperfectly again. Who is, by any external measure, kind of a mess. And the show loved him for exactly that. Not despite it, because of it. Because the mess is where the real person is, and the real person is the only kind worth knowing. Part 4. What Penny's shell taught you about hiding yourself. In Season 3, Episode 20, a school play about Beauty and the Beast goes sideways when Gumball, attempting and anxiously failing to kiss Penny during the performance, accidentally headbutts her instead with enough force to crack her shell. What comes out from inside the shell is not another peanut. It was never a peanut. Penny Fitzgerald, who has been for 3 seasons an anthropomorphic antlered peanut like the rest of her family, a self-contained shell-wearing creature who looks as ordinary as anything in the wild spectrum of Elmore's population, turns out to be something completely different. She's a shape-shifting fairy, something luminous and responsive and completely terrifying to Penny herself, Because when you've spent your entire life hidden inside something hard and safe and carefully managed, the moment the shell comes off isn't freedom. Not at first. Not from the inside. From the inside, it feels like destruction. While Penny runs, she transforms as she runs, her emotions finding physical form outside the shell for the first time. Fear makes her something large and threatening. Self-loathing makes her into the creature she's secretly believed other people saw when they looked at her. The entire town panics. The pest control van shows up. Patrick Fitzgerald, her father, arrives furious, orders Gumball away from his daughter, begins organizing emergency containment, put the shell back on, get her to a different school, return everything to the managed version before it gets any further from normal. And Gumball runs after her, not toward the fixed version, after the one that's running and transforming and terrifying everyone, including herself. After the one who has finally, accidentally become visible in the full complexity of what she actually is, and is convinced in that visibility that she has confirmed every fear anyone ever had about her. What happens next is one of the most carefully constructed emotional sequences in the show's entire run. Gumball chasing Penny through Elmore as she shifts from form to form, each transformation reflecting the emotional state she's in, each form a physical manifestation of how she's feeling about herself in that specific moment. Patrick eventually showing up and ramming the pest control van with his car to stop them from tranquilizing his daughter, because for all his fear and his insistence on the shell, he is her father, and watching strangers hurt her is more than he can permit, even in service of containing her. And then Gumball catches up to her. She's in whatever form her fear and her self-loathing have made her. Now something large and frightening and looking nothing like the fairy she is when she feels safe and loved. And Gumball looks at her and says, he likes her. Not in spite of what she looks like. Not regardless. He likes her. Period. Full stop. No conditions attached to the statement, no qualifier suggesting that the liking is contingent on her returning to something more manageable. She transforms. The glowing fairy. The one that was always there. The one that had been waiting for 3 seasons of accumulated mutual awkwardness and half-confessions and missed moments for someone to tell her it was safe to be it. The episode won the British Animation Awards for Best Children's Series and Children's Choice Award in 2016. Ben Bockley described it in one interview as Miyazaki-esque, while referencing Hayao Miyazaki's approach to letting emotional internal states become the literal visible environment of a story. That's exactly right. Penny's transformations make visible what is metaphorically true for almost everyone. How you feel about yourself is what you show the world. When you love yourself, you're something luminous. When you hate yourself, you look like the thing you're afraid of being. The shell, we eventually learn across multiple later episodes, is not simply vanity or social convention. The Fitzgerald family has been wearing shells for generations because their shape-shifting abilities are powerful and volatile and tied to their emotional states. And the tradition that developed around this is that you contain yourself to protect others from what you carry inside. Patrick doesn't experience his shell as suppression. He experiences it as responsibility, as care for the world around him. The shell is love, from his perspective. A kind of sacrificial self-management that says, I care about you enough to hide what I am so you won't be hurt by it. And Penny has believed this. She has constructed her entire sense of self around the idea that what's inside her is the dangerous part, the unstable part, the part that needs to be managed before it can be allowed to exist. Her shape-shifting, her emotional expressiveness, the way her insides become her outside, these aren't gifts she's been taught to appreciate. They're hazards she's been taught to minimize. Breaking the shell is breaking the story her family has told about itself for generations. Now, Penny is the first Fitzgerald in the family's entire history to come out of her shell and stay out. The first to say, with her actions rather than her words, that she doesn't think what's inside her is the problem, that the tradition of hiding has cost that nobody in the family has been honest about, that the world's ability to handle who she actually is hasn't been tested because the test was never allowed to happen, and she wants to find out what the test actually shows. This costs her. The show doesn't pretend it doesn't. Her father's disapproval, the family's discomfort, the specific pain of being the first person in your family to say that the thing everyone agreed was dangerous is actually fine. The first person to question a tradition that people love have maintained out of love, which means the questioning feels from inside the family, like a rejection of the love. But Penny stays out. That's the thing the show keeps returning to, not just in the shell, but in the transformation and the Amadane and every subsequent episode where her character appears. She stays out of the shell. She keeps choosing visibility over protection. She keeps being the person she revealed herself to be, even on the days when the shell looks comfortable and the world looks complicated, and nobody is watching in ways that make the courage feel worth it. That staying is the real lesson, not the dramatic moment of revelation. The staying, the ongoing daily decision to remain visible, the willingness to keep being seen, which is harder and slower and less cinematic than the moment you first become visible, and which is the actual work. The transformation is one decision. Now, the staying is 10,000. Growing up, particularly the kind that involves becoming honest about who you actually are, is mostly made of staying, of continuing to be the thing you decided to be even on the ordinary days. Penny took off her shell in one episode. She kept it off for the rest of the show's run. That's what bravery actually looks like over time. Not the moment of choosing, the years of honoring the choice. Part 5. Nicole Watterson and the Parent. You'll someday understand. Here's the thing about Nicole Watterson that children understand in one way and adults feel in their chest in a completely different way. When you're a kid watching Gumball, Nicole is the scary one. She moves faster than anything her size has any right to move and hits harder than physics should permit, and has a temper that, when it finally arrives, tends to restructure whatever it comes into contact with. She sets the rules and enforces the consequences. She asks the question you dread most, which is the one about exactly what you were thinking when you did the thing you did. She's the capable one, the together one, the one who would absolutely have held a functioning civilization together single-handedly if the rest of the Wattersons weren't quite so structurally and enthusiastically dedicated to its ongoing partial collapse. She can generate energy blasts when provoked. She can outrun sound. In the fight, she dismantles an entire house with her hands, belonging to Mr. Rex, in the course of a parent-to-parent confrontation that briefly achieves the intensity of a natural disaster. The show treats this as comedy, and it genuinely is comedy. But it's also the visual grammar of a character who has had to carry everything for years and has had to be strong enough for all of it, and whose strength is as much a symptom of what she went through as it is a quality she simply has. Then you get older, and you watch The Choices. The Choices is Season 5, Episode 5. IMDb gives it a 9.8. It follows Nicole through a series of alternate timelines showing you who she could have become if the critical choices of her life had gone differently. If she had won the karate tournament. If she had married a wealthy man named Harold Wilson. If she had taken the path her parents were steering her toward all the way to its logical extreme. And in one of those timelines, she does. She wins the tournament, she excels, she achieves, she accumulates power. And she becomes a futuristic authoritarian ruler in a silver suit. And the show plays this as funny, but also as a warning. This is where excellence without love goes. This is what optimization without warmth produces. But what The Choices really does underneath the alternate timelines and the visual comedy is show you everything Nicole was carrying before any of us started watching her. Her father, Daniel Senecourt, had a temper. Not abstractly. In specific ways that Nicole will recognize later in herself when the pattern surfaces in how she responds to her children. Her mother, Mary, was a perfectionist who could not, under any circumstances, be satisfied. An F grade on a report card, but the F isn't in a subject. The F is in Nicole's gender. Being a girl is not an excuse, her mother's notes indicate, for falling short. For choosing love over achievement. For being human in ways that didn't fit the performance that was required. This backstory is established in a handful of precise moments, and then the show moves on. It doesn't linger. It doesn't make the backstory the whole point. The point is Nicole at that dinner table in the present, with food on her face from the food fight that's erupted around her, with her family completely and cheerfully chaotic in every direction, looking at the life she built and realizing that she wouldn't change any of it. Not because it's perfect or because it's what anyone would have planned for her, Because it's hers. Because the love in it is real. Because Richard loves her in a way that her parents never quite managed, without conditions or performance requirements, and without a chart on the refrigerator measuring whether she's been worth keeping today. Now let's go to the fridge. Season 2, Episode 4. Nicole sets up an achievement chart on the refrigerator. A public ranking of the family's weekly accomplishments, organized from best to worst, with a star rating system and cloud tiers and a structure that is presented as motivational and functions as something considerably more complicated. When Gumball has achieved nothing that week, when he's in the rainy cloud row with no stars and no winds, Nicole's response is to put him through training that rapidly escalates from intense to something that, in a different context, would generate a very serious conversation with a school counselor. The episode is funny. Nicole using Gumball as a horse during a training montage is funny. On the desert scene where she drives away and leaves him to walk home is played for absurdist laughs. The paintball game is genuinely good comedy, but Gumball's speech at the end of it, quiet and specific and not a joke, is not funny. He tells Nicole he would rather be a disappointment to her than be a winner by her standards. And you can see in Nicole's face the specific moment when that lands through the filter of her own history. And she really understands what she has been doing. She has become her parents. Not completely, not permanently, but in this episode, in this week, in this specific response to a child who wasn't performing at the level she needed, she defaulted to the pattern she grew up in. The pattern that said performance equals belonging. That achievement is the currency of approval. That if you're not on the star row, you need to fix that right now, regardless of what it costs you or the person you're demanding it from. This happens to everyone who grows up in a difficult emotional environment and then becomes responsible for raising children. Not because they're bad people, not because they don't love their children with everything they have, but because the wiring is deep and the patterns run in the background without announcing themselves, and it takes constant, active, conscious work to choose something different. And some days the work fails. Some days the fridge chart comes out. What makes Nicole extraordinary as a character, what makes her one of the most psychologically accurate portrayals of a parent in any animated show, is that she has the moments of realization. She catches herself. She backs down. Now, she apologizes in her particular way, which is less verbal than physical, a clearing of the space and an acknowledgement of the cost. And then the show doesn't pretend it's resolved. The pattern keeps surfacing in smaller doses across multiple seasons, because that's how these things actually work. You don't resolve a generational pattern in an 11-minute episode. You resolve it by catching yourself again and again and again, until one day catching yourself becomes the default response rather than the exception. The Choices shows you Nicole at 18, walking away from her parents' expectations to build a different life. The Authority shows you Nicole and Richard fighting Granny JoJo's overprotection together, insisting on their children's right to encounter the world without a buffer. But The Fridge and The Hero show you the moments when the old pattern resurfaces and Nicole catches herself, and something shifts and she chooses differently. This is what breaking a generational cycle looks like from the inside. Not a clean break. Not a single heroic decision honored perfectly forever. 1,000 small decisions made over years, some of which succeed and some of which fail. And the direction of travel over time matters more than the score on any individual day. If you watched Gumball as a child and thought Nicole was scary, watch The Choices now. Watch it from wherever you are in your own growing up, and pay attention to what it's showing you. It's showing you someone who was hurt and chose love anyway, who was shaped by perfectionism and chose warmth anyway, but who was abandoned at the most important moment of her life and chose to be present, fully and imperfectly present for her children. And it's showing you that the people who seem the most together, the most in control, the most capable when you're small and they're large, had their own report cards with grades and categories that should never have been graded, had their own absent parents, had their own moments of standing at crossroads between who they were shaped to be and who they actually wanted to become. Nicole Watterson is not a perfect mother. She never once pretends to be. What she is, what the show insists she is across every season and every episode and every moment where she comes home from the Rainbow Factory and makes dinner and holds everything together by the pure force of her commitment to it. That is a person who chose her people and keeps choosing them. Even on the days when the old patterns surface. Even on the days when she defaults to the fridge chart. Even on the days when the work is hard and the love feels less like something soft and more like something she's doing with her whole body against significant resistance. That's the most human thing the show ever showed anyone. Not the strength, the continuing to try to be better than what made you, the catching yourself, the starting again. Part 6. Richard Watterson and the pressure to be something. Richard Watterson is the greatest character on the amazing world of Gumball, and this is a position I will hold for as long as anyone wants to test it. On the surface, he's the lovable oaf, Homer Simpson's warmth without the occasional cruelty. Peter Griffin's recklessness without the casual selfishness. A pink rabbit-shaped creature who sleeps enormous quantities and eats with a commitment that makes food look like a spiritual practice and approaches responsibility with an optimism that is entirely, magnificently disconnected from any practical ability to fulfill responsibility. He is, by the explicit mechanics of the show's universe, cosmically prohibited from having a job. When he gets hired as a pizza delivery driver in The Job, reality itself begins to fail. The sky cracks. Buildings warp. The laws of physics take a formal position against Richard Watterson's continued employment and begin enforcing it with unusual thoroughness. This is played as a joke. It's a very good joke, but the joke is also a door. And through the door is something considerably more interesting and more true than a running gag about incompetence. In the universe of Elmore, as we've established in other conversations, your existence has a designated function. The world has a role for you, and deviating from that role has consequences that scale with the importance of the deviation. Richard's designated function is to be present and warm and useless in measurable ways. The universe enforces this. Every attempt to be something different is met with the full weight of the world's refusal to accommodate it. This is cosmic, but it's also biographical, and the biography matters. Richard's father, Frankie Watterson, was a con artist who left. Not in a dramatic way, just left. The model of adult male behavior that Richard grew up with was either dishonest or absent. And his mother, Granny JoJo, filled the space that absence created with protection. Total, complete, suffocating, genuine, love-motivated protection that took the form of removing every obstacle before Richard encountered it. Every stumble caught before it became a fall. Every consequence removed before it could be felt. Every difficulty smoothed out before the friction could do the work that friction is supposed to do. The result, by the time Richard became an adult, was a man who had been loved completely and prepared for adulthood almost not at all. He couldn't hold down a job because he'd never been allowed to encounter the sustained difficulty that builds that capacity. He couldn't handle pressure because pressure had been systematically removed from his experience before it could teach him anything. Yet he arrived at adulthood with enormous warmth and genuine love for people, and almost none of the practical tools that the world expects adults to arrive with. In The Authority, Granny JoJo comes to visit and immediately begins wrapping the house in bubble wrap. Helmets appear on the children's heads. Every piece of furniture becomes a padded surface. The house transforms into the padded cell that Richard grew up in, and she does it with love, with genuine love, because she has never had another model for what protecting someone looks like. This is how you keep people safe. You remove the danger. You pad the corners. You make sure nothing can hurt them, and Richard, who knows exactly what that kind of protection cost him, fights it. He teams up with Nicole. They resist. Now, they insist on their children's right to encounter the world without the buffer, to fall and feel the fall and learn what they learn from it. He is doing for his children what was never done for him, leaving the world in place long enough for them to figure out how to exist in it. He can't undo his own limitations. The universe has made those fairly permanent. But he can make sure his children don't inherit the same ones, and that insistence is, quietly, one of the most heroic things he does in the entire show. The Hero, Season 2, gives Richard his most emotionally direct moment. Gumball and Darwin accidentally make fun of him for being useless, and he overhears them. The episode takes its time with his hurt, doesn't play it entirely for laughs. The hurt is real because the criticism is true in ways that Richard has not exactly made peace with, so much as accepted as the condition of his existence, and having his children echo it reopens something he'd thought was settled. And what the episode builds to is specific and important. The boys gradually realize what they've been overlooking. Richard's constant, unchanging, entirely unjudging presence. His absolute willingness to be the butt of every joke, to be the one who doesn't know things, to be uncool and incompetent in front of his children, without it ever diminishing the love. His enormous, gentle, continuous warmth toward all three of them without condition or revision. In a family where the pressure to perform is real and Nicole's intensity is significant, and Anais' competence is honestly a little alarming, Richard makes failure safe. He is the proof that you can be loved regardless of the fridge chart, regardless of how many stars you got this week, regardless of whether you're in the clouds or the rain. He loves his kids exactly as they are, in the exact moment, without any version of that love being contingent on what they're able to produce. That's not nothing. That's quite a lot, actually. The universe decided that Richard Watterson's designated function was to do nothing and remain as he is, and he found a way to make that function matter more than any of the ones he was denied access to. He converted a cosmic limitation into the thing his family needed most. He made the soft place to land out of exactly what the world told him was his only option. That's not failure. That's the bravest use of what you've been given. Part 7. Darwin and the question of who you actually are. Darwin Raglan. Caspian Ahab. Poseidon Nicodemus Watterson III was, before everything else changed, a fish. Not a person, not a character, not a member of any family or a participant in any adventure. A goldfish in a bowl. One in a sequence of replacement goldfish because the earlier ones had died and Gumball needed a pet, and that was the pet the family had available to offer. A fish with no name on a birth certificate, no backstory, no particular future, no reason to expect anything other than the ordinary, anonymous existence of a household pet that nobody thinks too deeply about. Then Nicole and Richard were startled by him speaking, and he went down the drain. The two-part episode, The Origins from Season 4, tells you what happened next. Darwin crossed an entire city, on newly grown legs, breathing with newly grown lungs, navigating traffic and predators and the hostile infrastructure of a world built for things completely unlike him, moving through a city that had no awareness of his existence and made no accommodations for what he was trying to do. He was trying to get back to the family that had accidentally lost him. And in the process of trying, his body responded to the necessity of the journey by building the tools the journey required. The show's explanation is the power of love. Gumball's absolute refusal to give up on him, his conviction that Darwin would come home, created something in Darwin's biology that drove the transformation forward. This is the beautiful version, and the version the show endorses most warmly, and the version that made a lot of people cry when they watched it for the first time. But underneath the beauty, if you stay with the story for a moment longer than the warmth requires, something quietly complicated emerges. Darwin's personality, everything that defines him as a character, his warmth and his honesty and his loyalty and his tendency to put other people's needs consistently ahead of his own, all of it emerged from a process he didn't choose and muscle in response to a role he was assigned rather than applied for. He was a fish. Fish don't have moral frameworks. Fish don't love their siblings. Fish don't experience loneliness or devotion or the specific particular ache of missing someone. Everything Darwin is was given to him. By the journey, by the love, by whatever force arranged for his transformation to produce exactly the character that the Wattersons needed him to be. And this raises one of the quietly important questions the show ever embedded in its premise. If everything you are was given to you by forces outside your control, for reasons you didn't select, are you actually you? The show's answer is unambiguous: yes. Darwin's warmth is real. His loyalty is real. His love for Gumball and for the family is genuine, not performed or strategic, something that came from somewhere outside his control and became entirely his own. The origin of a quality doesn't determine its authenticity. The fact that your kindness was shaped by your circumstances doesn't make it not your kindness. The fact that your values were installed by your experiences doesn't make them not your values. You are. In important ways, the sum of things that happened to you before you were old enough to curate them. And that sum is genuinely, entirely you. This is, as it happens, exactly how personality works for actual humans. You didn't choose your temperament. You didn't select the formative experiences that built your nervous system in the years before you had language to describe what was happening. You didn't choose the people who loved you or the particular ways they loved you, or what those ways taught you about what love is supposed to feel like. You got a starting point that was given to you, and then the world added to it, and then you did. And the result is the person you are. The question of whether that person is authentically you, whether the self assembled from all those unchosen inputs is valid and worth being, this is one of the oldest questions humans ask. Darwin answers it by being himself so completely and so consistently that the question becomes irrelevant. He was made by circumstance. He chose himself anyway. Over and over, in every episode, in every relationship, in every moment of moral clarity and loyalty, he chooses to be the person on. So the journey made him. In The Sidekick, Darwin gets tired of being exactly that, the sidekick. He wants to be recognized as something more than an extension of Gumball's story, as a person with distinct contributions and distinct value. The episode handles this with the show's typical light touch, which means it plays it partly as comedy and lets the resolution be small rather than triumphant. Darwin's selfhood gets acknowledged within the friendship rather than in opposition to it. He doesn't leave. He doesn't choose independence over Gumball. He insists on being seen as a distinct person, and that insistence, modest as it seems, is the whole thing. Darwin is the show's most sustained answer to the question about identity and origin that the show keeps quietly asking. Not the answer in the abstract, the answer in the living. Every episode of Darwin being kind, being honest, being loyal, being himself with consistency and warmth, regardless of circumstance, is the show saying, yeah, this is you. It came from outside you and it became entirely yours. The origin and the authenticity are not in opposition. You are the accumulation. The accumulation is you. Part 8. Jealousy, Friendship, and Learning to Share Space with Other People. The Flower, Season 2, Episode 5. It opens on Gumball watching Penny in cheerleading practice, doing this in the entirely unsubtle way that 12-year-olds watch people they are in love with when they think nobody is noticing, which is to say completely visibly and with all the concealment of a weather balloon. Everything is fine. Penny completes a move. Gumball cheers. The world is bright and ordinary and in order. Then Leslie, the flower kid, walks over and hugs Penny hello, and the thing the show calls jealousy takes possession of Gumball's body. The comedy that follows is fast and precise and very funny. Jealousy, in the body of a possessed Gumball, attempts to frame Leslie for theft, sets up an insect trap in a park, tears petals off things, and does basically everything the most unhinged version of Gumball's fear of losing Penny would do if it had access to his hands and none of his inhibitions. Now, the other characters spend most of the episode saying, wow, in flat voices. Gumball keeps waking up confused and increasingly concerned about the evidence accumulating against him. The resolution: Leslie and Penny are cousins. Always were. There was no threat. The entire sequence of destruction came from a misreading of a completely ordinary moment of family affection. Leslie says, reasonably, that he wishes Gumball had asked. Gumball says, reasonably, that he wishes he had too. The joke is finished, but the thing the episode was actually building, underneath and around the comedy, stays with you. Because jealousy in The Flower is not portrayed as a moral failing you either have or don't have. It's portrayed as a possession, something that lives in Gumball and takes over when certain conditions are met. Something that uses his hands and his voice and his entire history of loving Penny to do the things his rational self would find most embarrassing. The experience from inside, which the show lets you feel through Gumball's brief moments of awareness, is not comfortable agency. It's the specific horror of watching yourself do something you would not choose while being unable to interrupt the mechanism that's making you do it. That's jealousy. That's what it actually feels like. Not a character flaw you choose to act on, but a state you enter and have to exit, something that happens to you rather than through you, even as it's happening through your hands and your voice. And naming it that way, giving it a physical form that's visibly separate from Gumball while also visibly being him, is the show doing something more useful than a lesson. And it's giving you a way to understand the experience when you're in it. It's saying, this thing that's happening, it has a name. It's not you. It's in you, but it's not the whole of you, and there are exits. The jealousy episodes accumulate across the show's run. The third has Gumball jealous when Darwin starts spending time with Tobias. The Bros has Darwin jealous and possessive when Gumball starts dating Penny. The Sidekick has Darwin jealous of his own position in a friendship, wanting to be valued differently. The BFFs in Season 6 has Darwin jealous of a childhood friend from Gumball's past who reappears. Each approaches the same underlying territory from a different angle. How do you stay in a close relationship as both of your lives expand? How do you love someone and also let them have things and people that aren't you? But how do you recognize the difference between a connection that sustains you and a dependence that constrains you, especially when you're in the middle of it and the distinction hasn't been explained to you and you're working primarily on instinct? The show's persistent answer is not a technique or a lesson. It's a portrait of two people choosing each other repeatedly, after the jealousy, after the bad behavior, after the moments where both of them acted in ways they'd be embarrassed to describe. Not because the jealousy has been solved or the fear has been resolved, but because the relationship is more important than the comfort of having resolved everything first. Alongside the jealousy, there's a constant thread about communication, about how you talk to people you're close to. The words, Season 2, is the clearest example. Darwin has been so careful with his words for so long that he's lost the ability to say anything honest at all. He sits on the bus next to Sussy, who is being spectacularly annoying, and cannot bring himself to ask her to stop because the asking requires acknowledging the problem, which feels like a statement about her worth as a person. Gumball, who has none of these scruples, simply asks Sussy politely, and she stops with complete equanimity, and Darwin is astonished. Then Darwin learns to be direct, overcorrects wildly, and briefly insults everyone in the school in a musical number they unfortunately join. Because the middle ground between never saying what you think and saying everything you think is where actual life has to be conducted, and finding that middle ground is harder than it looks, and you will almost certainly overshoot while you're calibrating. This is the whole lesson about friendship and communication that the show keeps returning to across its entire run. The people you love don't belong to you. Their time, their attention, their love, even when it's specifically directed at you, doesn't belong to you in the sense of ownership. The people you're close to are going to have other people and other things and other needs, and your job isn't to minimize those. Your job is to stay present through them, to trust the connection enough not to have to protect it by limiting everything that might be competition for it. And then to say what you mean when it matters, kindly, directly, without the accumulation of unsaid things creating a pressure that eventually detonates in a song insulting everyone in the cafeteria. Darwin and Gumball do this imperfectly, repeatedly, spectacularly imperfectly at several points across 6 seasons. And they keep choosing each other on the other side of the imperfect. That's the portrait the show was building all along. Part 9. Depression, Bad Days, and the Wisdom of the Downer. Season 3, Episode 37. The Downer. Gumball is in a bad mood. Not the cartoon exaggerated kind with a clear cause and a clear solution waiting in the third act. Just a bad mood. The morning kind. The kind that's there when you wake up like furniture you didn't order, with no specific origin and therefore no obvious route to resolution. The kind where other people's cheerfulness is a specific texture of terrible, and their attempts to help make it marginally worse, and you know that, and you still can't respond differently. His family tries. Richard has an encouraging speech delivered in his particular combination of genuine sincerity and half-asleep delivery. Darwin organizes things. Anais deploys logic. Nicole offers options. All of it lands on Gumball like noise, like the specific sound of other people's functioning aliveness, rubbing against a mood that doesn't have room for it. He wishes they would all just disappear. And they do. Gumball finds himself alone, not just in the house, in the world. The streets of Elmore are empty, the school is silent, the mall has nobody in it. Every space that was crowded and loud with other people is now stripped bare, and he has exactly what he said he wanted. Total silence, total absence, complete freedom from the noise and presence of everyone else. And it's worse. Considerably, specifically worse. Because the bad mood, without other people to generate friction against, without the background noise of daily life to give it something to push back on, simply expands, fills the available space. The world begins to reflect the mood back at him. Signs change to darker versions of themselves. The sky takes a different quality. And then a physical darkness begins accumulating at the edges of things, a shadow closing in from the periphery toward where Gumball is standing in the center of his own emptied world. And it's not funny anymore. It's the real kind of dark. It's the kind that comes from inside and projects outward until you genuinely cannot find the line between your mood and the world you're looking at. Gumball runs. The darkness follows. Darwin appears from the direction of the house. The darkness recedes. Then the reveal. His family was there the whole time. It was a hallucination. Not a literal departure of every person in his world, but the visual representation of what the bad mood felt like from the inside. A world emptied of everyone who mattered. A world contracted to just him and the weather system in his head, with the darkness as the only company. Ben Bockley has said publicly that this episode was substantially rewritten because the original draft was too dark. The show acknowledges this in the mythology around the episode. The final version is careful. It doesn't name what Gumball is experiencing with clinical language. It doesn't categorize it. It just shows you the phenomenology of it, the actual texture of the experience from the inside, with more accuracy than most storytelling aimed at adult audiences manages. The color drain. The way familiar places become alien when you're in a certain kind of interior weather. The way other people's presence goes from comfort to irritant before it goes to absence. The way the darkness is internal first and then projected, before the projection becomes its own experience of the world as dark. The way rescue comes not through willpower or resolution or the application of logic, but through someone else showing up and the interior reality shifting in response. This is, if you've been through your own version of this experience, remarkably accurate in the ways that count. Not complete, not clinical, but accurate in the way that resonates, that makes you feel less alone in what you've been through, which is the particular service art performs when it's working at its best. The episode aired on Cartoon Network in 2015 between episodes about cartoon hijinks and sentient food. And the fan responses to it across 10 years are consistently from people who found it at some hard point in their lives and felt for the first time in a while that something had described their experience correctly. That someone had looked at the interior landscape of a bad mental health day and rendered it accurately enough to recognize. That matters. That's not a small thing. In the context of growing up specifically, but when the emotional register is expanding so rapidly that you frequently don't have language for what you're experiencing, having something that shows you your own experience reflected back without judgment or diagnosis or a pat resolution, at the end is genuinely valuable. It says, this happens. This happens to people. You are not uniquely broken for experiencing it, and it passes. Part 10. What Gumball was actually saying the whole time. Here is the truth at the center of everything we've covered tonight. The Amazing World of Gumball was not primarily a show about the void. It was not primarily about simulation theory or existential horror or the mechanics of cancellation as metaphor for obliteration. So those things are in there, and they are genuinely brilliant, and they represent some of the most formally ambitious storytelling ever attempted in a children's animated format. But they are not the engine. They are the outer atmosphere. The thing that makes the engine run, the thing underneath all the philosophy and the world building and the beautiful, intricate metafiction, is something much older and much more ordinary and much more necessary. The engine is the experience of being young, of becoming older, of the space between those two states, which is where all of us spend a significant portion of our lives, which is where the specific and bewildering and sometimes unbearable and often beautiful work of becoming yourself gets done. Consider what the show spent 6 seasons building, episode by episode, character by character. And a boy who is afraid of change discovers that The change might be the whole point, a family where everyone carries something heavy from before and is trying with varying degrees of success to put it down before it reaches the next generation. A girl who lived in a shell and took it off and was terrified and chose to stay visible anyway. A goldfish who became a person through the specific alchemy of being loved, and then spent every day choosing to be the person that love made him. A mother who was shaped by perfectionism and chose warmth. A father who was shaped by absence and chose presence. A little sister who is 4 years old and asking about determinism because the questions don't wait until you're old enough to look composed when you ask them. All of them are in the middle of something. All of them are figuring it out. All of them are carrying things and putting things down and keeping secrets in the basement and trying every day to be a slightly better version of whatever they were yesterday with varying degrees of success and no reliable map. Gumball himself, this impulsive, chaotic, sweet-natured, frequently disastrous 12-year-old blue cat, is not a metaphor for the human condition in the abstract. He's a specific portrait of a specific kind of kid at a specific kind of moment. The kid who knows, somewhere below conscious awareness, that this version of his life is not going to last. The kid who throws himself into every adventure and every misadventure and every spectacularly bad idea with an urgency that looks like recklessness, but is actually something closer to knowing, not knowing what's coming. But knowing that the thing he has right now is temporary, and the only sensible response to temporary good things is to be in them completely. Ben Bockelay built this from his own experience. His own family, his own memories of being a kid who made messes and a young adult who made pitches that didn't land, and a creator who gathered all the things nobody wanted and gave them a home. He said in interviews, repeatedly, that the ideas came from real places, that the comedy was built from real life, that the mess was real because he remembered what it cost. And the result is a show that finds people, that found children who were too young to understand what was making it resonate, and adults who came back to it years later and discovered what had been underneath all along. Now, that found people at hard points in their lives and gave them something accurate, something that named the experience correctly without simplifying it or resolving it too neatly. That's the show. That's what it was doing. The emotional honesty of Gumball is unusual in children's television because it refuses to promise you that growing up will be fine. It doesn't tell you the confusion will resolve at 18, or that your parents will figure it out, or that the friendships will stop being painful in the specific way that close friendships are painful. It doesn't tell you the bad days won't come back. What it tells you is different and, I think, more useful. It tells you that growing up is happening to everyone, all the time, even the people who look finished. Even Nicole with the energy blasts. And even Richard, who the universe has designated as cosmically incompetent. Even Anais, who is 4 years old and already noticing that her intellectual toolkit is insufficient for the size of the questions she's encountering. All of them are in the middle of it. All of them are figuring it out as they go. All of them are choosing their people repeatedly, imperfectly, with full knowledge of the cost. That's what Gumball was saying the whole time, under the goldfish, with legs and the void and the brilliant visual chaos and the jokes that make you laugh before you realize they're also making you feel something you didn't expect to feel. You are in the middle of something. You always are. The middle is not the problem. The middle is where everything real happens. The signal still holds one more thing before we close tonight. Something about what the show means now and what it's still saying. The Wonderfully Weird World of Gumball, the revival that arrived on Hulu in July 2025, brought back the same characters, the same Elmore, the same essential mix of visual chaos and emotional honesty. New voice cast, new creative team, Bockelay himself in an executive producer role rather than frontline creator. And in the interviews around the revival, the creative team described something about the show's DNA that I think deserves its weight. They described the show as working in 3 modes. The personal story that comes from someone's actual life experience, the social commentary on something happening in the world right now, and the experimental formal episode that uses the show's unique visual vocabulary to tell a story in an unexpected way. The personal story comes first. That's not an accident. That's a values statement. The root of everything Gumball does is the real human experience buried inside the premise. Without that root, the metafiction is clever, but not necessary. Without that root, the void is an interesting concept rather than something that lands. Bacale said in the Animation Magazine interview that the show's ideas come from real places, from things that happen to children and adolescents, that it stems from real experience. And he said this about a show that's been running for well over a decade, about characters that have been alive in the cultural memory for that long, about stories that have been found and loved by people at very different stages of their own growing up. The show is named after Bill Watterson, the man who chose to let his creation rest rather than continue it past the point of honesty. The man who proved that sometimes the greatest act of love for what you've made is knowing when to let it be finished. The Wattersons, named after him, live in constant fear of exactly that: being finished, being forgotten, being consumed by the void that takes everything the universe decides isn't worth keeping anymore. And the irony of them being named after the person who chose oblivion over compromise is one of the show's deepest and most unresolved tensions. It's a show about characters desperately fighting not to be forgotten, named after the man who walked willingly into obscurity rather than be something less than what he made. I don't think this resolves. I think it's meant to sit there, uncomfortable, by pointing at something true about the relationship between love and impermanence, about what it means to hold on to something versus what it means to let it be what it was. But here's what I know. Whatever ends or doesn't end, whatever the void takes or doesn't take, whatever version of the show continues and whatever version of Elmore persists, this particular thing, the thing the show was always saying underneath everything else, is going to keep being true. The experience of being young is going to keep being what it is. The fear of change and the desire for it are going to keep living in the same chest. The voice is going to keep cracking. The shell is going to keep being taken off and kept off or put back on. Or the choice is going to keep being made. Nicole is going to keep catching herself before the fridge chart goes too far. And Richard is going to keep being the soft landing. Darwin is going to keep choosing to be the person the journey made him. And Gumball is going to keep throwing himself into every adventure with the urgency of someone who knows, on some level, that nothing lasts, making the most of it while there's still time, making the most of it while there are still people to make it with. Whatever your version of Elmore looks like tonight, whatever middle you're in, whatever you're carrying or putting down or keeping in the basement for now, you're in the right place. The signal is holding. The static is still background noise. Make the most of it, you're still here. And that's where we're going to leave it tonight. If you made it all the way here, genuinely, thank you. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Whether this was midnight on a Tuesday or a lazy Sunday afternoon or 3 in the morning when the room is very quiet. We love knowing you're here. If something in this felt true to something you're carrying, share it with someone who might need it. And if you're not subscribed yet, please do. Every subscriber keeps Watterson lore going, keeps us making the kind of content that actually tries to say something true. Until next time, sleep well. End of script. Part 11. The lesson of the finale. When consequences finally arrive. There's an episode in Season 2 called The Finale. It does something that most episodic animated shows spend their entire runs carefully avoiding. It remembers. Not in the warm, nostalgic way, not in the highlight reel of our greatest adventures way. It remembers with receipts. The premise is simple and the execution is devastating in the best possible way. The Wattersons are taken to court, not for one thing, for everything. Every piece of property damage, every act of casual destruction, every time Gumball and Darwin and the family unleashed some kind of chaos on the town of Elmore, and then walked away while the episodic reset quietly erased the consequences, all of it gets presented at once. The citizens of Elmore show up with their evidence. Larry Needlemeyer, who has been on the receiving end of more Watterson-related catastrophe than any single person should have to absorb, makes his case. The school, the city, the entire population of the town, everyone has a grievance. Everyone has been waiting for this moment. And the Wattersons can't deny it. Because it all happened. The show knows it happened. The show is fully aware that the episodic format it lives in, the format where consequences reset and nothing carries forward, and the next episode begins fresh, is a kind of injustice to the people who got hurt in all the previous episodes. It's acknowledging its own structure and calling it what it is. A system where the main characters get to be reckless and destructive and other people absorb the cost. This is a sophisticated thing to do in a children's cartoon. It's the show stepping back from its own premise and saying, look at what we've been doing. Look at who benefits from the reset and who doesn't. The Wattersons get to start fresh. Larry doesn't. The citizens of Elmore don't. The damage is real even when it's treated as comedy. Watch, the consequences are real even when the narrative chooses to move past them without accounting for them. And the resolution is not clean. The episode ends with Nicole essentially suggesting they go back to the way things were, which means another reset, which means erasing the evidence of everything again. And the show knows that's what it's doing, and it lets you see it knowing. It's the most honest thing the show could do with its own structural dishonesty. It didn't fix it. It couldn't fix it without dismantling the format entirely. But it showed you the bad. What does this have to do with growing up? Everything, actually. One of the things that adolescence is that nobody tells you clearly enough when you're in it is the beginning of consequence memory. Children operate in something like an episodic format. Things happen. Now they're felt, and then the next thing begins without a full accounting of what was left behind. Not because children are bad people, because the architecture of a child's mind and the architecture of the world that's built around children to accommodate that developmental stage allows for more reset than any adult experience ever will. At some point in the growing up process, the consequences start accumulating. The things you said last year that hurt someone are still there last year. The relationships you damaged casually in the assumption that the reset would come are not always repairable. The habits you formed in the years when habits felt like temporary experiments are harder to revise than you expected. The debt accrues, and at some point, usually not dramatically or all at once, but in the particular grinding way that maturity tends to arrive, you find yourself in your own version of the finale. Standing in front of everything that was treated as consequence-free and discovering that consequence-free was never actually the correct description. That was just the story you were operating inside of, and the story had gaps, and the gaps were always going to show up eventually. The finale is the show telling you this clearly. The reset is not neutral. The reset is a choice. The choice has costs, and the costs are real regardless of whether the format acknowledges them. There is something else the finale does that I want to name, which is that it shows you what accountability looks like when it finally arrives, and the person it arrives for hasn't been prepared for it. The Wattersons are overwhelmed, not because they're bad people, because they're people who have been operating in a system that consistently insulated them from the feedback that would have prompted growth, and now the feedback is arriving all at once, and there's no framework for processing it at that volume. This is also a thing that happens in growing up. The insulation runs out, the reset stops coming, and the person you've become in the absence of consequence, feedback suddenly has to function in a world that has consequence feedback built into every interaction. It can feel catastrophic. It often looks catastrophic from the outside. And the appropriate response, which the show can't quite give the Wattersons because it would require dismantling the premise, is not another reset. The appropriate response is the slow, uncomfortable, unnecessary work of building a self that can handle accountability, that can look at what it did and sit with the discomfort of having done it without immediately reaching for the mechanism that makes the discomfort go away. That's the work. That's always been the work. The finale names it. Part 12, the message hidden in the mixed media art style. I want to spend some time on something that we've touched on, but not fully developed, which is the visual language of the show itself. Because the way Gumball looks is not just an aesthetic choice, it's a statement. And understanding what it's saying changes how you read everything else. Every character in Elmore is rendered differently. Gumball and Darwin and Nicole and Richard and Anais are traditionally drawn two-dimensional characters. Tina Rex is three-dimensional CGI. Thus, the Robinsons look like puppets, thick contoured and slightly stiff. Idaho has the tactile solidity of stop motion. Sussy is a live-action human body part filmed upside down. The backgrounds are real photographs of actual places, mostly from London, where the show was produced, giving the world a real-world texture against which all these mismatched animated styles play out their mismatched lives. This is not incidental. This is not just Boclet being experimental or wanting to stand out visually. This is a world built on the premise that nobody fits. that everyone here came from somewhere else, was designed for a different purpose, exists in a visual register that doesn't match the visual register of anyone around them. The photographic backgrounds don't match the drawn characters. The drawn characters don't match each other. Thus, the whole world is a collection of things that shouldn't cohere and have cohered anyway, out of proximity and love and the accumulated necessity of sharing space. And here is where the visual design becomes a direct statement about growing up specifically. Because one of the things that adolescence does to you, that childhood largely doesn't, is give you an awareness of not fitting, of being in a space, a social space, a physical space, a family space, a cultural space that wasn't quite designed for who you are, of being the different animation style in a world of apparently matching ones, of looking at the people around you and feeling, sometimes with sharp clarity, that you're working from a different set of source materials and the gap between your source materials and theirs is not bridgeable in any simple way. That this experience is universal, but it feels singular when you're in it. It feels like evidence of something specifically wrong with you, rather than like evidence of the ordinary human condition. And one of the things that Gumball does quietly and consistently through its visual design is show you a world where the mismatch is universal, where everyone is a different animation style, where Gumball the two-dimensional cat, and Tina Rex, the three-dimensional dinosaur, and Idaho the stop-motion potato all go to the same school and eat in the same cafeteria and navigate the same social hierarchies and feel, at various points, completely out of place in the world they're living in. The show is saying, the mismatch isn't yours specifically. The mismatch is the whole world. Everyone here doesn't quite fit. Everyone here came from somewhere else. Add to the coherence that Elmore achieves, the unlikely harmony of all those mismatched styles existing together, is not the result of everyone finding their correct place. It's the result of everyone choosing to be here anyway, mismatched and imperfect and working with the tools they have in the space that's available. That's the visual grammar of the entire show. And it's the most direct statement about growing up that the show ever makes, rendered not in dialogue or plot, but in the fundamental design choice of how the world is put together. Growing up feels like being a different animation style in a world that seems to have its style more sorted out than you do. Like running on different source files. Like looking at the people around you and wondering whether you missed the handout that explained how to do this correctly. And the show's answer, present in every frame for 6 seasons, is that everyone is running on different source files. Everyone is a different animation style. The world is made of that entirely, and the fact that it functions at all is itself a kind of miracle that happens through choice and proximity and love rather than through everyone being the same kind of thing. That's worth knowing. It's worth knowing when you're 12 and it feels like evidence of catastrophic personal wrongness. It's worth knowing when you're 25 and still sometimes feel it. It's worth knowing at any age when the particular flavor of not fitting makes it seem like a conclusion about your value rather than just a description of the universal condition. Everyone in Elmore is a reject. Everyone. Bacalé said that. It's built into the show's DNA. And they built a world together anyway. Part 13. What Anais knew that nobody was asking about. In all these hours of conversation about Gumball and growing up, I've given Anais less time than she deserves. Let me fix that. Anais Watterson is 4 years old. She speaks 4 languages. She understands advanced mathematics. She is, by an enormous margin, the most intellectually capable member of her family and probably of her entire school. Even though her school contains students who are 8 to 10 years older than her, and she skipped ahead because her intelligence left the standard curriculum nowhere useful to put her. The show plays this as a running joke and a character trait. Anais is the competent one, the smart one, the one who has to parent the rest of the family sometimes. Who solves problems while everyone else is still figuring out that there's a problem. This is funny, and it is genuinely funny, and the show earns the comedy from it consistently. But Anais is also the loneliest character in the show, in the specific way that gifted children are lonely, which is the loneliness of not having peers, not having people your own age who operate on your wavelength, not having the social toolkit that kids develop when they're allowed to go through the developmental stages of friendship at the appropriate pace rather than skipping ahead into a peer group whose emotional development is years ahead of yours, even if your intellectual development is years ahead of theirs. She can solve differential equations. She can't figure out how to make a friend without smothering the potential friendship in intensity. In The Friend, she tries desperately to form a friendship with another child and ends up with an imaginary one instead, a terrifying, violence-prone imaginary friend, because the real ones don't work out. The show plays this for laughs, and then you think about it for a moment longer, and the laugh catches. Anais knows more than almost anyone around her about how the world works mechanically and intellectually. She knows less than almost anyone around her about how to be in it emotionally and socially. And the gap between those two things is the specific trap that gifted children walk into. You're trusted with the intellectual adult world before you're ready for the emotional adult world, and the two don't develop at the same pace. And the result is a person who is simultaneously ahead and behind in ways that make both directions uncomfortable. In The Oracle, Anais is the one who asks the question that the episode is actually about. After Banana Barbara's paintings come true, after Gumball ends up naked on TV exactly as the painting predicted, Anais looks at the camera and asks, would any of this have happened if we hadn't seen the painting? She's asking about determinism, about whether observation changes outcome, about whether the future is fixed or whether the act of seeing it creates it. She's 4 years old and asking one of the oldest questions in philosophy, and she's asking it not as an intellectual exercise, but because the answer genuinely matters to her. Because Anais builds models. That's how she navigates the world. And she takes in information and builds models of how things work and then uses those models to predict and understand and navigate. And if the world is the kind of place where seeing a painting makes the painting come true, if reality has that kind of recursive quality to it, then her models are insufficient for the world she's actually living in. And if her models are insufficient, then the thing she most relies on to exist comfortably in the world, which is her ability to understand it, is less reliable than she thought. This is Anais's specific version of the growing up experience that the show explores through all its characters. The moment when the framework you've been relying on turns out to have gaps. When the understanding you worked so hard to build turns out to be incomplete in ways you hadn't accounted for. Like when you're smart enough to see the limits of your own intelligence, and that's not a comfortable place to stand. And the show, being the show, doesn't resolve this for her. It doesn't give Anais an episode where she develops the social skills she lacks, or finds the peers who operate on her wavelength, or gets a clear answer to the question she asked in the Oracle. It just leaves her being exactly who she is, brilliant and lonely and 4 years old, and asking questions that don't have clean answers, in a family that loves her and doesn't always know how to reach her and keeps trying anyway. That's Anais. That's her version of the thing the show keeps saying. You're in the middle of something. The tools you have aren't always sufficient for the thing you're navigating. That's not a failure. That's the condition of being alive and aware in a world that consistently outpaces any framework you build for it. Part 14. The whole thing, said simply. I want to take a moment before we close to say what we've been talking about in the simplest possible terms. Because sometimes you spend a long time circling something, and it's worth stopping and saying it clearly before moving on. The Amazing World of Gumball was, from its first episode to its last, a show about what it costs to be a person in the process of becoming one. About the specific experience of being in the middle of something that has no manual, no guaranteed outcome, no promise that the version of yourself you arrive at will be the one you were hoping for. About the fear of growing up and the fear of not growing up, and the narrow, uncomfortable, a deeply true space between them where actual life happens. It was about the parents who shaped you and the ways that shaping was imperfect, and the work you'll eventually have to do to figure out which parts you want to keep and which parts you want to revise. It was about the friends who knew you before you knew yourself and the complicated love of being known. That completely, and also needing to become someone your oldest friends are still learning. It was about the shells you wear, all of them, the ones your family gave you and the ones you built yourself, and the ones you put on because the world asked you to, and the long project of figuring out which ones are protection and which ones are prison. It was about the bad days, the inexplicable ones, the ones with no origin story. And it was about the way those days can make the whole world look different, and the way they pass. It was about the small, real wins that matter more than any performance. About the value of showing up, imperfectly and repeatedly, for the people who chose you and whom you chose. And it did all of this through a 12-year-old blue cat and a goldfish with legs, and a family that should not function at all, and somehow functions entirely on love. Set in a world built from photographic backgrounds and mismatched animation styles, and the accumulated DNA of every character that was ever rejected from somewhere else and found a home here. Bacale built this show from the things that were left behind. He took the rejects, the things nobody wanted, and he gave them a world to exist in. And what the show became? Over 6 seasons and 2 miniseries and a revival, and more years of being watched and rewatched and thought about than anyone could have predicted, is proof of the thing it was always saying underneath all the chaos. The things that don't fit anywhere else can still matter enormously. The things that don't fit anywhere else can be exactly what was needed. The world has a place for you, not because the world was designed with you in mind, but because the world is made of everyone who doesn't quite fit anywhere else. And somehow out of all that not fitting, something coherent and warm and worth being part of gets made. That's the show. That's the whole thing. John, the signal still holds. Final words? I started tonight by telling you about an episode where Gumball and Darwin's voices crack and they learn to make the most of it, and then get told they're never going to grow up and discover that forever is its own kind of loss. I want to end by coming back to that, because the thing about the kids, the thing about all the episodes we've talked about tonight, is that they're not nostalgia pieces. They're not about looking backward at something lost. They're about being in the thing while you're in it. Being present to the temporary nature of the current moment, not as a source of grief, but as a source of attention. A reason to notice. A reason to feel it fully rather than numbly. To be in Elmore while Elmore is available to be in. The show kept returning to this. Not explicitly, not in speeches, but in the texture of the storytelling. The way it lingered on small moments. The way it built its best emotional beats not from dramatic confrontations, but from quiet recognitions. Nicole looking at her food-covered family and laughing. Darwin showing up in the dark. Penny staying outside the shell. Gumball choosing his own name. These are all small things. Ordinary things, in the logic of the world. And the show kept saying, the ordinary things are the ones that matter. The small real wins are the ones that save you. The people who show up are the ones who count. The moment you're in right now, whatever it looks like, is the one you'll someday wish you'd been more present for. That's what it was saying the whole time. Through all the absurdism and all the comedy and all the visual chaos and all the brilliant metafiction. Underneath it all, be here. Make the most of it, You're still here, and tonight, wherever you are, whatever time it is, whatever middle you're navigating, you're here. The signal is holding. The static is background noise. That's enough. Get some rest. Gumball and Darwin will still be in Elmore when you wake up, still causing chaos, still finding each other at the end of every dark episode. And so will you. Thank you for being here tonight. If you've made it all the way to the end of this one, genuinely thank you. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is, because we really do love knowing you're out there. Share this with someone who might need it. Subscribe if you haven't yet. And until next time, sleep well. End of script. Part 15. The world of Elmore and why it feels like yours. Close your eyes for a moment, or keep them half open, the way you do when you're not quite asleep, but not quite awake either, drifting in that warm corridor between the two. Think about the town you grew up in, not the idealized version, not the postcard. The real one, the one with the gas station that never seemed to have the right snacks, the park that flooded every spring, the neighbor who played music too loud on Saturday mornings, the one that felt small, sometimes suffocating, but also, and this is the part people forget, also felt like the whole world. Because when you're young, your town is the whole world. It's the only world you've been given permission to know. Elmore is that town. Not literally, of course. Elmore is a place where a peanut is sentient, where a T-Rex works at a convenience store, where a ghost girl sits in the back of a classroom and occasionally haunts her own homework. Elmore is, by every technical definition, completely insane. But here's what the show understood about place and about growing up inside a place. The specificity of a setting isn't about whether it's realistic. It's about whether it's emotionally true. And Elmore, absurd, chaotic, borderline lawless Elmore, is one of the most emotionally true towns ever put on television. Consider the way Elmore functions. It's a town where everyone knows everyone, where your embarrassments are public, where your father, the magnificent and catastrophically useless Richard Watterson, can become locally famous for falling off a bicycle in slow motion, and then somehow the whole neighborhood has an opinion about it by Tuesday. This is not surreal. This is just small-town life with the volume turned up. The feeling of being watched. The feeling that your family's business is everyone's business. The feeling that the version of you that exists in other people's minds is somehow already set in stone, already decided, already whispered about at the supermarket. Gumball spent 12 seasons, 6, fighting that. Fighting the version of himself that Elmore had already decided he was. The kid who failed. The kid who caused problems. The kid whose dad was Richard. And part of what makes the show so quietly devastating is that Elmore is never the villain. It never presents the town as something to escape from or conquer. Elmore is just there, ambient and alive, neither hostile nor supportive. Just the container that the Wattersons happen to exist inside. The way your own hometown was just there, not evil, not kind, just the water you swam in. There's an episode where Gumball becomes briefly obsessed with the idea that Elmore is a simulation, that reality isn't real, that the town is a construct, that nothing matters. It's played for laughs, of course, because it is genuinely funny to watch a cartoon cat have an existential crisis in front of a rainbow unicorn and a cloud man. But under the comedy is something that every teenager eventually thinks. What if this isn't real? What if this place, this school, this house, this neighborhood isn't the actual world? What if the actual world is somewhere else waiting for me to arrive? And the show's answer, quiet, almost whispered under the jokes, is even if it is a construct, you still have to live in it. You still have to be kind in it. You still have to mean what you say in it. That's not a nihilist answer. That's actually the opposite of nihilism. It's a kind of stubborn, small-scale meaning-making. The show says, yes, things might be absurd. Yes, the rules of your world might be arbitrary. Yes, the adults around you might be confused and flawed, and occasionally incapable of tying their own shoes. And yet, your feelings are real. Your friendships are real. The way you treat people matters, even in a town where a piece of living toast goes to school with you. Think about the school. Elmore Junior High? The setting of more Watterson catastrophes than any reasonable building should be able to survive. It's not a good school. The principal seems to have no actual authority. The teachers range from mildly competent to actively disturbing. The curriculum is unclear at best. And yet the show understands that school is not primarily about curriculum. School is about proximity, about being placed in close quarters with people you didn't choose, people who are not like you, people who are strange and loud and confusing, and learning about or failing to learn, but how to share space with them without completely losing yourself. Gumball fails this constantly. He loses himself. He overcorrects. He tries too hard, or not hard enough, or he tries in completely the wrong direction. He embarrasses himself in front of his crush, in front of his enemies, in front of audiences both real and imagined. And this is the Elmore that matters. Not the flying rainbows, not the sentient furniture, the school hallway, the lunch table, to the gym class where nobody passes the ball to you because you're the kid who dropped it that one time. The show also does something unusual with Elmore's geography. It never quite explains itself. Streets loop back on themselves. Locations shift. The town has an almost dreamlike quality of being familiar but unmappable. You can never quite trace a reliable route between two places. And this, once you notice it, feels completely intentional. Because this is how memory works. You can't draw a map of your hometown from memory. You can navigate it by feel, by habit, by muscle memory, but the moment you try to describe it precisely, it blurs. You remember the smell of the place before you remember the layout. You remember how it felt to ride your bike down a certain hill before you remember the name of the street. Elmore works the same way. It's a memory town. It exists the way childhood exists in the adult brain. Vivid in patches, blurry in geography, emotionally overexposed in some places and almost faded in others. And so when you watch Gumball from a distance, when you're older now or becoming older now or somewhere in the long middle of becoming, what hits you about Elmore isn't the jokes. It's the familiarity, the low-grade recognition that says, I have been in this kind of town, I have been in this kind of school. I have been the kid who said the wrong thing and watched the hallway go quiet and thought, I cannot survive this, and then somehow survived it. Elmore is your town, cleaned up and distorted, put through a cartoon filter and handed back to you with all the feelings intact. That's what good storytelling does with place. While it doesn't build you a perfect replica, it builds you an emotional resonance. It says, the geography isn't the point. The feeling of the geography is the point. And Gumball, this weird, structurally unstable, impossibly ambitious cartoon, understood this from its very first episode. It understood that a town can be a character, that where you grow up shapes you the way weather shapes stone, slowly, invisibly, until one day you look at yourself and see the erosion patterns and realize, this is where I'm from. This is the texture the world gave me, and there is nothing wrong with that texture. There is nothing wrong with being shaped by an imperfect place. Because every place is imperfect. Every town, every school, every house, they all have the broken gutters and the too loud neighbors, and the gas station that never has the right snacks. And you grew up inside yours and you turned out here, reading or listening at this exact hour of night, still carrying the emotional weather of a place that made you. Elmore made the Wattersons. Your hometown made you. And both of those things are fine, more than fine actually. They're the whole story. Part 16. The thing about watching it again. There's a specific feeling that comes with rewatching something you loved as a child. It's not quite nostalgia. Nostalgia is warm and uncomplicated, like a candle in a window. This feeling is more layered than that. It's warm and a little sad at the same time. It's the feeling of standing in a doorway you used to fit through easily and realizing, with a shock that's somehow both sudden and gradual, that you've grown. Not just physically, in every direction, in ways you didn't notice while they were happening. Rewatching Gumball does this to you. The first time you watch it, the first time when you're young and the show is new and you're the target audience, you watch it for the jokes, the absurdity, the way the animation shifts styles between scenes. The faces Gumball makes, the running gags, the sheer creative chaos of a show that refuses to stay in one register for more than 40 seconds. You watch it for entertainment, which is the right and proper way to watch a cartoon, and it delivers entertainment in enormous, generous quantities. But the second time, or the fifth time, or the time you put it on for background noise while you're doing something adult and responsible like paying bills or cleaning your apartment, something different happens. The jokes are still funny, the animation is still brilliant. But underneath all of that, now that you're no longer in the target demographic, now that you've lived enough to have scar tissue over a few of the wounds the show was quietly prodding, you start hearing the other thing. The thing that was always there, patient and unhurried, waiting for you to be old enough to receive it. You hear the loneliness in Gumball's bravado, the way he performs confidence because real confidence was never quite available to him. You hear the exhaustion in Nicole's perfection, the way she pushes, because stopping means thinking about what she gave up. Like you hear the sadness in Richard's contentment, or maybe the wisdom, or maybe both at once, folded together the way real things are. You hear Darwin's questions, all those gentle, earnest, slightly too sincere questions, and you realize he was always the moral center. Not Gumball. Darwin, the one who arrived in this family by accident and chose to stay, chose to care, chose to mean it every single time. And then you hear Anais, quiet, precise, quietly furious Anais, the one who understood everything and was understood by almost no one. The one who was 4 years old and already knew that the world was going to ask her to fit herself into a box and was already bracing for the argument. You hear her and you think, I know you. I think I've always known you. I think you were me, or I was you. Or we were different versions of the same thing. The person in the room who sees too clearly and has to decide every single day whether to say what they see or let it go. Rewatching a show is an act of self-archaeology. You are digging through layers of yourself. What you noticed the first time tells you what you needed then. What you noticed the second time tells you what you've learned. What you noticed the third time, in the small hours of the morning, half asleep, the glow of a screen the only light in the room, that tells you something harder to name. Something about what you're still working on, what you haven't finished growing into yet. Because here's the thing about growing up that Gumball kept circling without ever quite landing on in a single definitive statement: it doesn't end. There is no episode where the credits roll and you are done. There is no finale where Gumball wakes up as a fully formed adult who has processed all of his childhood and resolved all of his contradictions, and is now ready to engage with the world as a stable, integrated human being. The show ends, it ended, and the ending was its own kind of commentary on endings. But the growth didn't end with it. It kept going the way growth always keeps going. Past the last frame, past the closing theme, into the quiet of whatever comes after. You are still growing. You know this. You feel it some nights more than others. Feel the stretch of it, the slow, uncomfortable movement of becoming someone slightly different than you were last year. You feel it when an old belief loosens its grip, when a habit you thought was permanent quietly dissolves. But when something that used to hurt stops hurting quite as much, replaced by a different kind of ache, which is actually progress, even when it doesn't feel like progress. Gumball understood this, not in the way a textbook understands it, not in the way a therapist explains it, but in the way a story understands it, from the inside, from the lived experience of characters who are never done changing, who keep waking up in Elmore and facing another day in which they are both who they've always been and slightly different than they were yesterday. There's something comforting in that, if you let it be. The show wasn't trying to give you answers. It was trying to show you that the question, who am I? Who am I becoming? Who do I want to be? Is not a problem to solve. It's the texture of being alive. It's what consciousness feels like from the inside, the constant, low hum of self-revision, the ongoing project of personhood, the daily renegotiation between who the world decided you are and who you actually feel yourself to be. Gumball Watterson spent 6 seasons trying to figure that out. He didn't succeed exactly, but he kept trying. He kept showing up to Elmore Junior High in his little black turtleneck, half terrified and half convinced that this day would be different. This day he'd finally get it right. And sometimes he did. And sometimes he catastrophically didn't. And both of those outcomes were, in their own way, the whole point. So here you are, watching or listening at this hour, probably tired, probably in bed, probably with the particular tiredness that comes not just from a long day, but from a long stretch of days, and a long stretch of being alive and trying to be good at it. And here is what Gumball would say to you if Gumball were capable of being sincere for an uninterrupted 45 seconds, which he mostly wasn't, but sometimes was, in the quiet moments between disasters. You're doing better than you think. Not perfectly, not even close to perfectly, but better than you think. The fact that you're still asking the questions, who am I? What do I want? How do I want to live? Is not a sign that you're failing. It's a sign that you're alive to it, that you haven't gone numb, that somewhere in you something still wants to know, and that something is the best thing about you. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Let that settle for a moment. Let the room be quiet. Let Elmore recede back into the soft middle distance of half-memory. Let the Wattersons get on with their cartoon lives, their absurd catastrophes, their love that is messy and obvious and completely sincere. You've been with them a long time tonight, through the kids changing voices and the shells coming off, and the alternate timelines and the dark episodes, and the friendship that asked too much, and the parents who were both flawed and trying. You've been through all of it. Now let yourself rest. Let yourself be somewhere between asleep and awake, in that warm corridor again, where the thoughts slow down and the questions stop demanding immediate answers. And the night is just the night, soft and dark and yours. You've earned it. Part 17. The Wattersons are still there. There is a version of you that still lives in Elmore. You might not have thought about this before, but consider it now. Yeah, in the soft quiet of wherever you are. There is a version of you, bye-bye. The one who first watched this show, the one who laughed without knowing why it felt familiar, the one who was in the middle of growing up and couldn't yet see the shape of what was happening. That version of you is still sitting in Elmore Junior High, eating lunch, trying to figure out where to sit. That version of you never left. We don't leave the places that formed us. We carry them. They become part of the structure of how we understand the world, part of the invisible architecture behind every decision we make, every relationship we attempt, Every moment where we have to choose between the easy version of ourselves and the honest version. Gumball taught you something about that invisible architecture. Not in a lecture, not in a lesson, in the oblique, sidelong way that the best art always teaches, by showing you recognizable things in unfamiliar shapes, until the recognition creeps up on you from behind and taps you on the shoulder and says, "You already knew this. You knew it the whole time. I was just reminding you. You knew that growing up was going to change you in ways that couldn't be undone." The kids knew it. The voice actors knew it. The way Logan Grove's voice cracked between recordings knew it. That biology doesn't pause for anyone, doesn't wait until you're ready, doesn't ask permission before rewriting your body and your voice and your relationship to the person you thought you were. You knew that identity was going to be a long negotiation. Penny knew it, trapped inside her shell, but performing the version of herself that felt safe until the night Gumball looked at her, really looked at her, and said that whatever was inside was something he wanted to see. You knew the shell. You've worn a version of it. Maybe you're still wearing a version of it, and maybe that's okay. Maybe the shell doesn't have to come off all at once. Maybe it comes off in pieces, slowly, in circumstances of your own choosing, with people you trust. You knew that your parents were carrying their own damage. Nicole knew it. The daughter of perfectionist parents, shaped by pressure she never asked for, becoming the pressure she never wanted to apply but couldn't quite help. The cycle was always there, visible to anyone looking from the outside, but from the inside of a cycle, it's invisible. That's what cycles do. They feel like gravity, like just the way things are until someone stands outside the pattern long enough to name it. And then slowly, with enormous effort, with setbacks and backslides and mornings when the old habits reassert themselves with full force, the cycle can change. Not break, not disappear, change. You knew that friendship was going to be more complicated than you expected, but Gumball and Darwin, two beings who loved each other with complete sincerity and still managed to hurt each other, still competed, still got jealous, still had to learn over and over again that love is not the same as understanding, and understanding is not the same as patience. And patience is a skill you build across years of practice, not something you arrive at because you care about someone. You knew that some days were going to be dark, but that some mornings you'd wake up and the color would have leaked out of everything and you wouldn't know why, and it wouldn't necessarily be anyone's fault, and the world would just look flat and gray and uninviting. The Downer was a whole episode about this, about sitting inside the gray and not knowing how to move through it, about needing other people not to fix it but just to be nearby while it passed, about the fact that it passes, not always quickly, not always easily, but it passes. You knew all of this. The show didn't teach it to you, it reflected it back at you from a screen in the voice of a cat and a fish and a cloud man and a small, terrifyingly smart pink rabbit. And it said, "You're not alone in this. These are the things everyone goes through. This is what it costs to be a person. This is what it looks like to be a family. Not a perfect family, not a functioning family by most definitions, but a family in the true sense, which is people who choose to come back to each other, even after everything, even when it would be easier not to." The Wattersons always came back. Richard got up off the couch. Nicole put down the achievement chart. Gumball apologized, badly in his Gumball way, but meant it. Darwin asked the right question. Anais sighed and explained it one more time, with slightly more patience than you'd think she had. And they all sat down to dinner in that pink house in Elmore, with the dog rabbit and the sentient cloud and the whole strange, impossible life they'd been given. And they stayed. That's the thing, in the end. That's what Gumball was actually saying. Not that growing up is easy. Not that it gets simple. Not that the questions resolve themselves into neat answers, or that the damage heals without scarring, or that the person you become is the person you planned to become. None of that. The show was too honest for that, too rooted in the real texture of family and adolescence and identity to offer you the easy version. What it said, what it kept saying, episode after episode, through the comedy and the darkness and the mixed media and the existential asides, was this: stay. Stay in your life. Stay present to the people who love you. Stay curious about who you're becoming. Stay willing to change. Stay willing to be seen, even when being seen is terrifying. Stay willing to say I'm sorry and mean it. Stay willing to grow up without pretending that growing up is painless. Stay, that's the word. That's the whole word. The Wattersons stayed in Elmore, in each other, in the ongoing, strange, beautiful, difficult project of being a family, in a world that made no particular promises about how any of it would turn out. You can do the same thing in your life, in your Elmore. With your Wattersons, whoever they are, whatever improbable assortment of people the world has placed next to you and said, these are yours, figure it out. You already are figuring it out. You've been figuring it out this whole time. Now rest. The pink house is quiet. The lights are off in Elmore. Everyone is where they're supposed to be, sleeping the untroubled sleep of cartoon characters between episodes. And somewhere in that stillness, in that warm, improbable town, a blue cat is dreaming about tomorrow. I'm not worrying about it, not strategizing, I'm just dreaming. And the dream looks a lot like everything being, against all available evidence, basically okay. Let yourself dream like that tonight. You've earned the peace of not having to figure anything out for a few hours. Good night. Thank you for watching, or listening, all the way to the end. If this script found you at the right moment, if something in it landed the way it was meant to land, leave a comment below. Tell me which part stayed with you, and if you want more of this, more slow, careful, late-night explorations of the shows that quietly shaped you, subscribe. New videos when they're ready. Not rushed, just ready. Sleep well.